Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. NCAA Tournament Week. Indiana begins play on Friday night. The latest possible tip I think you can receive for the opening weekend of the NCAA Tournament. Indiana will play Friday night. 9:55 is the scheduled tip time, Eastern time. We know it'll probably be later than that just based on how these things go and how the TV schedules are lined up. But the Hoosiers will play Kent State, champions of the MAC. And to help us break down this matchup, obviously a team that we're not as familiar with our Big Ten focus, Rocco Miller, who covers college basketball as closely as anybody, but he knows a lot about the mid-major scene. He's been on the show. Rocco, you've been on the show before, but welcome back to Podcast on the Brink.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Alex. How are things going? How are we feeling going into the tournament?
Yeah, it's I think an interesting draw, obviously, for the Hoosiers. You never know with kind of these. I feel like the 4-13, 5-12 matchups are historically every year some of the most dangerous games in Indiana. Here as a 4 seed, going to have to go through obviously Kent State, and then if they're advanced, could play either the ACC champion or Drake, who a lot of people are picking to move on in the tournament. So Indiana obviously has a chance to advance on to Kansas City, but I feel like they're going to have to play 2 really good games to get there. Let's start with Kent State. I know you're familiar with them. I've started to do my research on them, and one of the things that really stood out to me is just how challenging of a non-conference slate they played. And you don't really see this a lot of times because schools maybe don't want to play a team like Kent State. So credit programs like Houston and Gonzaga for being willing to play them. But the first thing I just kind of thought about looking at who they've played is they're not going to show up to this game on Friday night and say, wow, we're playing Indiana. They've been kind of in this position before. They've played the team this year that's the number 2 overall seed in the tournament, a team in Gonzaga that has obviously star power in Drew Timme and has made multiple deep tournament runs. They didn't win those games, but how competitive they were in those games tells me a lot about this team.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think a lot of what happened this year, you have to trace back to last year. Last year's team, they got Carey in the portal from Duquesne, who's obviously the star, MAC Player of the Year. Malik Jacobs this year is the MAC Defender of the Year, and I should say Defensive Player of the Year. Carey was the Defensive Player of the Year last year. So these 2 guards are not only experienced but have great accolades. Kent State this year has a top 35, top 40 defense overall, and when you look at last year. They started the year. They took on some tough games last year. They went to West Virginia. They went to Xavier. They played some other tough mid-major teams. Took a bunch of losses. They entered MAC play 5-5. Not a lot was thought of them. And then they just got red hot starting late January all the way through the end of the season last year, finishing on a 12-game win streak. Entering the MAC tournament, they get all the way to the finals. They knocked off a very good Ohio team last year in the semis, and they lose by 20 to Akron. In part because Akron's their, if you're not as familiar with the MAC, they're their big rival locally. I think the 2 schools are only 7 miles apart. And there was a video that went out the night before, got 3 starters suspended for the championship game for the first half, and they were down by almost 20 at half. They ended up losing the game by 20. Akron, of course, goes on to March Madness and gave UCLA a pretty good game. The MAC representative, just for Hoosiers out there, knowledge-wise, usually puts up a big fight regardless of who it is. And that led us into this year and into the scheduling season of last year. And I get a unique opportunity to work with a lot of schools nationwide, both power conference, mid-major, low major, et cetera, in the scheduling space. And Coach Senderhoff, kudos to him. Me and him were in touch quite a bit throughout the summer. It was very important to him to schedule some big opportunities to get these guys ready for this moment. I think, Kent State was right there I think they were the pick preseason to win the MAC. And if not, Toledo was right there as another elite option. You also had Ball State came along great under Michael Lewis, first-year coach, finished 4th. And Akron was really good again this year too with Enrique Freeman. So those were the clear top four coming into the year. And Kent State was able to get Gonzaga to play them. Luckily, Gonzaga wanted to make their schedule a little bit more tougher outside of those marquee games they play. So they brought in a Kent State, they brought in a Montana. Those are higher level teams than they usually would play in those extra 7-8 games they can schedule. So kudos to Gonzaga, and great job by Senderoff to be that first team in line. In Houston's case, I think Houston was just frustrated that nobody else would play them, that they finally just settled on Kent State, seeing that they were projected top 100. But in both of those games, I think that's a great place to start. In the Gonzaga game with about the media timeout with under 4 to go, Kent State's up 7. And in that game, they put a lot of ball pressure on Gonzaga's guards. There was a lot of questions about Gonzaga at the time. This was early December, losing Nemhard to the NBA, trying to break in Nolan Hickman. Gonzaga had, was toying with who the ball handler should be, and that just played right into Kent State's hands. With Jacobs and Carey both being elite defenders, what they like to do is force a lot of turnovers and create a lot of steals. They actually create steals at over a 22% rate of possessions, which I looked at Indiana's schedule this year. That's the highest rate out of any of Indiana's opponents. So in that category, that's definitely something with a red flag, in terms that Indiana should be preparing for this week as they get ready for this game. Probably nice that you have the Friday night game in that regard. You have a little bit extra time to prepare. But I do think that's how they gained an advantage against Gonzaga. What ended up happening late was Kent State just could not. They made plays. They got into the lane. Sincere Carey's an incredible slasher and driver. Sometimes he'll take it all the way to the cup and get to the line. Other times he'll just stop on a dime and pull up from 15. Sometimes he'll pull up from 3. So he's a really unpredictable player to defend, especially on the run. And then he'll find his teammates. I think Jared Sullinger's a guy. Jalen Sullinger's a guy that you really got to be aware of. He's a top 100 3-point shooter in the country at 42%. He doesn't take enough attempts, in my opinion. He never takes more than like 5 or 6 a game. But when he does, he's going to give you 2 or 3 makes, and he's really timely with those makes. But in that particular game, they just couldn't hit a basket late. Timmy took over down the stretch, and Gonzaga survived. In the Houston game, I think they were tied with a minute to go, and an unfortunate turnover and a 3-point miss, and they end up losing by 5. But in both of those games, they played unbelievably well defensively. The Houston game was in the 40s, 49-44, I believe. So that shows you Kent State's commitment to defense. They'll throw. I think there'll be stretches at the Indiana game where they'll throw double at TJD because if they don't, TJD's got a big advantage in the post. It's not a very big Kent State team. But anyway, I'll turn it back to you for more questions. But those are some initial thoughts just based on those big opportunities they had and looking at Indiana's strengths and weaknesses coming into this game.
Indiana seems to have had some trouble this season with teams that can kind of spread them out and go to the basket, whether it be Penn State, who was able to spread them out a couple times and get open threes with kind of Jalen Pickett and him picking them apart. And then also the games that really come to mind, Northwestern, although they're not a team that takes or makes a lot of threes, they were able to kind of spread Indiana out and get drivers and get guys going to the lane. From an offensive perspective, Kent State, obviously their offense is outside of the top 100 on KenPom, but do Carey and Jacobs kind of have the capability of getting where they want to go off the bounce on the drive, and what how much of a concern does that have to be for Indiana in terms of picking up fouls and things like that? Because obviously there's not a ton of depth at the guard position with Xavier Johnson now out for the rest of the season. Jalen Hood-Schifino and Trey Galloway have both at times gotten themselves into foul trouble, and that seems like it could be a potential problem for Indiana if those guys, I'm not as familiar with how they like to play offensively, but it sounded like from what you were saying that they do have a little bit of that in their game.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Kent State prefers to do is get runouts where they can, whether that's off of a missed shot or if they can create steals. They've been able to rely on that throughout the year. 22% rate is a very high rate of creating turnovers, and so that's their preference. But I think in the half court they do tend to struggle more than other great teams, particularly in the MAC, just because they are a little undersized. They can't move as well. They can get a little stagnant. But I think if, to answer your question, Carey's that guy that can create. He's got NBA level talent. He will get looks in the league, and again, he's pretty unpredictable, and he's really hard to get take the ball away from. He's very strong with the ball, and he's usually able to get to where he wants to be on the floor, whether that's the mid range or lower. Jacobs is an excellent mid range player, and he actually kind of prefers that part of the court to do his damage or do his work. So they look to get him the ball either in those positions off of screens or have him come in from the 3-point line and then do his damage that way. So they have a lot of different mixes. Rob Senderhoff's a very creative X's and O's coach. I believe he's a former Indiana manager. So there's a lot of great ones out there. I know I actually just talked to Dusty May yesterday from Florida Atlantic, another one. So these guys are really smart guys, and they run a lot of good stuff to create for these players. Merton Thomas is another really effective player. And what I'll say about all three of those guys, Carey, Jacobs, and Thomas, is they play a ton of minutes. So if Indiana, on the flip side, can get some foul trouble on any of those three, it could really change the game late. I am anticipating a pretty competitive, hard-fought battle here, and the foul issue could really play into it. You see it in the NCAA tournament a lot, especially with a big brand power school like Indiana playing a underdog champion from a mid-major school, where they're just trying to fight segment by segment, right? From one TV timeout to the next. I think in some ways, from a foul standpoint, that could help Indiana, but I think from a stamina standpoint, it's going to help Kent State, because I don't think they want to go too deep into their bench. I think they want to rely on these guys, and the TV timeouts are longer in the NCAA tournament. So I think, that's been able to help teams like this. We saw it with St. Peter's last year, sustain a heavy amount of minutes throughout the game. So anyway, so offensively, schematically, they're going to find looks for those guys. Sullinger can beat you deep if you leave him. On the interior, you've got Von Cameron Davis, who's undersized, 6'5" guy, but he battles hard, and they'll throw some of his fouls at TJD and others on Indiana's front line, and then and Hornbeek's another guy, doesn't play a ton of minutes, but at 6'9", 225, they're going to need his body against Indiana. And so we saw him utilized a little bit more in the Houston matchup, for example. So I kind of expect the game plan to be similar to Houston from a frontline approach standpoint.
On the Rob Senderoff thing, listeners of the show will get on me if I don't make the clarification. He was a former Indiana assistant, actually on staff under Kelvin Sampson when all of the rules violations went on there. So it's interesting, the path that Indiana has here potentially. You've got Senderoff, who obviously not looked upon favorably by Indiana fans based on his history there. Second round, you have a potential of playing Drake, who has former IU assistant Tom Ostrom on staff. And then in the Sweet 16, if Indiana got there and Houston got there, it'd be Indiana against Kelvin Sampson, which would be quite the storyline. I'm sure the people putting together the TV schedule, that's something that they're hoping to see. In terms of coverage on Trayce Jackson-Davis, obviously it feels like most games he's probably going to get his numbers. You mentioned the potential for them to maybe send some double teams at him. Do you think the strategy will be more of kind of let Trayce get some buckets and try to slow down Jalen Hood-Schifino? It kind of seems like the teams that have beaten Indiana, at least recently, have tried to slow down Hood-Schifino and maybe let Trayce, because it almost feels like at times Trayce is inevitable, right? He's going to get his numbers to an extent. Maybe you try to make him shoot something like 9 of 19 from the field instead of 9 of 13. But and make his catches harder and that. But I'm just kind of curious how you see them trying to slow down Indiana offensively. And the other thing that I think really concerns Indiana fans just from watching the games in Chicago, Trey Galloway scored 2 points total in 2 games. There was a lot of instances where the ball was kicked out to Miller Kopp, and instead of taking the open three, he pump faked and dribbled in a couple dribbles and took a, maybe even a worse shot. It almost seemed like, he was maybe a little tentative to make that fly. And I'm sure that won't be lost on Kent State when they watch film of these last couple of games. So do you think the strategy is going to kind of be to try to make some of these other guys as uncomfortable as possible and just realize that TJD is probably going to get his 20, 25 points?
Yeah, I think you're on the right track there. I think from Kent State's standpoint, their bread and butter is to pressure opposing guards. And I think you just knowing that Hood Schifino's had some games where he got a little sloppy with it and turned it over. I think some games recently he's been a little stronger. But knowing that they can do that better than almost anybody that Indiana's faced, I think they've got to depend on their bread and butter more than anything. Knowing Senderoff, I've been out to Kent State and covered a game there. Not this year, but a couple of these players were there when I was there a couple of years back. And just getting to know him and what he likes to do, they're not really a team that wants to deviate what they're strong at. So, I think for the majority of the game, that's going to be the game plan. And I think my gut would say they would want to do that early to try to build some type of lead and get the momentum early going out there in Albany, and maybe try to get some of the casual fans pulling for the underdog. But from a TJD standpoint, they are going to have to pick their spots to double, not just let them have every single thing. I think they've got to learn some lessons from when Timmy really just took over in the Gonzaga matchup. Because again, that's the only other elite big man they played this year at this level, where All-American level player in the interior. So I like them to throw in some doubles from time to time to just make Indiana think. And I like what you said about what happened in the Big Ten tournament, seeing that maybe Penn State had some success with getting Galloway out of the mix, making Miller Kopp make decisions. That's something they could really lean on. I'm most curious, just from a Kent State perspective, how are they going to adjust? And, assuming that, let's say the game is close in the final 5 minutes. I mean, because they really could have won both those Houston and Gonzaga games, which would have dramatically changed their perspective, their seed and everything. They probably would have been an at-large team if they win maybe even either of those, especially if they win both. How are they going to learn and recover from those moments and be ready for the moment this time? I had questions about because Kerry actually had pretty bad games against both those teams. He had really poor offensive ratings. He scored less than 10 points in both games, uncharacteristic. But recently he's played really well. He had a big 30-plus point performance last week. So, yeah, I don't know that they need him to go big, but just as a team, is everybody ready to pick up the slack? Or is that familiar feeling going to come back where they get tight and the big school takes over down the stretch and they lose close again? That to me is like the biggest mystery, because they really were in both the Houston and Gonzaga games really aggressive and took it to both teams for 36 minutes. And it was just that final segment where they weren't as confident and they lost, they turned the ball over, gave up easy buckets late and just got a little unorganized. And that was all the difference in the result. So for Kent State's perspective, I think that's the biggest question mark. I don't have much doubt that they'll be the aggressor and they'll probably be able to build a lead at some point in this game. But if you're Indiana, maybe you're just there running your stuff, depending on everything that's worked all year, and weather the storm for a while and maybe expect Kent State to stumble late. We'll see.
This has been somewhat of a, I guess, trendy upset pick. Where do you kind of fall in terms of who you see moving on in this game, and maybe what do you see as maybe the most important thing that Indiana has to do to be able to march on to the round of 32?
Yeah, I think Indiana has to take care of the ball. I mean, that's number one with the team that's high volatility, elite defender, defending on the perimeter. ball security is huge for Indiana. I think if they can do that, and they can wear down Kent State, maybe even get them into foul trouble, Indiana can maybe even build up a decent enough lead to get out of there. I have a hard time seeing it being a comfortable game because Kent State is built on being feisty and tough and battling for 40 minutes. It really will take some big run if Indiana were able to build like a 15-0 run or something to get Kent State out of what they like to do and change all their different pieces of offensive scheme and defensive tenacity. That could help tremendously, obviously. But I do think it comes down to the wire. Indiana also, the other thing that comes to mind, Alex, is last year they got the win against Wyoming in a tight one in Dayton, had to fly all the way to Sacramento, and of course got beat up by St. Mary's down there. But, that's really, for most of these guys, the only tournament experience. Kent State themselves, they haven't been in either. So a lot of these players, and even Hood-Schifino, be his first crack at it, right? So I'm curious to see how they all handle the moment. Maybe being on a Friday night, it helps because you sit around all day and you watch all these other games, get a little comfortable. But in the end, it would be easy to pick Kent State just as an upset pick. I think Indiana has worked really hard, and maybe losing in the Big Ten helps a little bit, just get an extra chip on their shoulder. And especially we're here on Inside the Hall, I got to take Indiana to win.
The other game in this pod, you've also got two really competitive teams. You got the ACC champion, obviously, in Miami. They've got an uncertain injury situation, and then Drake, who I believe is a Missouri Valley team that won their conference tournament and earned a bid. What just kind of obviously can't look ahead from an Indiana perspective, but we can look ahead here on the show in case they do advance on to play in the round of 32. Which of those teams would be a better matchup in your mind for Indiana, Drake or Miami, and what maybe are the keys to that game for both teams?
Yeah, I would say actually Drake's is a better matchup for Indiana just athletically. Miami's so athletic. And Indiana's got good athletes as well, no doubt about it, with two NBA guys on the Hoosiers. But if Omier can play, and that's one of the guys you were mentioning with the injury question mark, he brings a whole different dimension. He transferred in this year from Arkansas State out of the Sun Belt, and he was an absolute machine at Arkansas State, averaging nearly 14 rebounds a game. He's still a double-double guy at the ACC level. Obviously, they have Isaiah Wong's been a great player there for a couple of years now. Nigel Pack, well documented, lured in NIL-wise from Kansas State, just an elite scorer. Jordan Miller's a great player. Even Poplar, their other wing there. They've just got great efficiency and tenacious rebounding. So there's a lot to like about Miami, especially offensively. 12th best offense in the country. But Miami gives up a lot defensively. They only 130th defensively. I think that's just because they have an offensive mentality. They took on all these high volume scorers in the portal. They're giving up a little bit defensively by doing that. So I do think Indiana, Miami, you could see a big high scoring game. But I think, just athletically, that's basically a coin flip in my book. Miami's actually a team I had circled in February as a high upside team just with all the talent. Because even in the NCAA tournament, at some level, if you want to get to the Final Four, especially if you want to get to the championship, you need elite shot makers and scorers. Miami's got all that. So that's the danger. But obviously defensive lapses, who knows, motivation-wise, we have to see where that's at. I respect Larinaga. You have to assume they're going to be ready to go. On the Drake side, they're as solid as they come in terms of the mid-major ranks. If anybody watched Arch Madness, the way they performed in the championship game against a very good Bradley team was beyond impressive. They're full of veteran players. Roman Penn, it feels like he's been there for a decade. Their star point guard. Tucker DeVries is the coach's kid. He's got NBA-level talent and shot making. And I think he's got some upside to maybe even sneak into the first round from what I hear in the NBA. DJ Wilkins has been there for a long time, and both Penn and Wilkins played in the NCAA tournament in 2021, and also played the year before, where Drake's been great in all 4 of these years. So just with the experience and the confidence and the cohesion, Drake's very dangerous. And I think that gives them a great shot to beat Miami. I also think if Omier doesn't play for Miami, Drake might even be the favorite to win that game. But I think if it's a Drake-Indiana matchup second round, I just think with TJD being a much better athlete, they would probably have to put Darnell Brody on him. Brody's very susceptible to foul trouble. I did the Drake Indiana State game this year out in Terre Haute, and that was a thing that Indiana State was able to take advantage of when they beat them. And I think Indiana would have a lot of different matchup advantages as well. Drake doesn't really get after you. I mean, they do have a top 45 defense, but you can kind of get what you want on the perimeter a little bit easier, if that makes any sense, especially coming off of Kent State. I think it'll be a breath of fresh air against either of these teams if they can get out of that game. So in general, I think the best path for Indiana is to, without being too obvious, is playing the 13 and the 12 in this case. But it's more of a matchup thing because I do think Drake's got a great shot to beat Miami.
Just overall big picture, where Indiana is right now as a 4 seed in the tournament, given the injury situation, do you feel like they're about where you thought they would be coming into the tournament? Obviously, last year they're one of the last teams in. They win a first 4 game, go to Portland and lose to St. Mary's. And then this year they come into the season with high expectations. I think they were a top 15 team in the preseason. They were actually, I think, 15th on the NCAA's seed list that came out for the tournament. So right about where they were projected in the preseason. Just overall, what kind of your thoughts on an Indiana season as a whole, and kind of what maybe if they met expectations in your eyes or fell a little short?
Yeah, I think it's probably about where I would have struck the balance, because I think we heard a lot of pundits put them top 5 at certain points last summer. I thought that was a little extreme. And then I also didn't think they'd be a bubble team again like they were last year. I had a hard time putting them, much higher than where they landed, just because you're talking about a team that is trying to get over the hump, missed the tournament a couple of years ago, got Woodson in there, got back to the tournament. It was just a balance for me of how big of a leap can they make. Going 21-10 in the regular season, 22-11 overall. I think I had them somewhere around 21st preseason. So for me, maybe even a little bit more than I expected. But I also think I was lower than most of the national guys out there. So I would say they exceeded it just by a little bit. Coming in, especially bracket wise, overall seed list wise, the clear number 2 in the Big Ten, beating Purdue twice. I think some of that was matchup, but I also think that shows Indiana's ceiling. So that's pretty exciting, especially as you get into some non-conference games now in the tournament, teams that haven't seen you. That's exciting. It kind of shows a high potential. I think Indiana will have a lot of pressure on them this week, but if they can get themselves to Kansas City and play Houston, then everything flips. Now they're kind of the underdog role, and I think Indiana will embrace that.
Rocco, where will you be here the next couple of weeks for the tournament? We'll for Inside the Hall, we'll have William McDermott out in Albany, weather permitting. Hopefully, he can get there Wednesday. They're having a pretty big snowstorm, I understand, out there. We'll see in terms of his flight on Wednesday. He'll be out there for Inside the Hall. Where will you be here these next couple of weeks for the tournament?
So this week, plan to be in Las Vegas. It's an annual tradition with old friends. I think we're about the same age, so it's been going on about 20 years now. So I got to get down there. I might only go down there for a couple days, but at least check the box. For me, I love the first weekend of the tournament. I don't think there's a better weekend of the college basketball season than this weekend coming up. Just 48 games in 4 days is tremendous. Beginning Thursday morning out here on the West Coast. And then next week, planning to be at Madison Square Garden. Very excited about that. Cover the regionals. I had the regionals last year in San Francisco in the backyard here. Just a great experience. Last year, Coach K was here. We had Gonzaga, Arkansas, and Texas Tech. It was a fantastic regional. So now I've got a goal to just cover a different regional every year and who knows, over the next decade, be able to see a lot of different great arenas and different teams. And who knows, I might get Duke again going to New York this year. But,
Could
from
get
my
Purdue
standpoint,
too, right? Purdue's in that bracket, right?
Purdue's in that bracket. And Purdue, I mean, if I can comment on them, they got a brutal draw, because I'll tell you this, whoever comes out of Memphis, Florida Atlantic is going to be a very tough game. I think by far the strongest 8 and the strongest 9, and they're playing against each other. I just interviewed Dusty May yesterday, so check that out. But anyway, so I think that'll be my plan next week. And then all of Final Four week, I'll be in Houston starting Tuesday. The coaches convention happens throughout the week, so I meet with a lot of coaches. We get started on the 2024 scheduling, filling out some leftover tournaments that aren't done yet, and then getting into some of these matchups like Kent State versus Gonzaga. Hopefully we can put more of those together for next year. So that's what the rest of the tournament looks like for me.
Rocco, thanks for the time. We always appreciate it. I know it's a busy time, so thanks for carving a little bit of time out of your schedule to join us this week on Podcast on the Brink.
My pleasure, Alex. Good luck against Kent State. It's going to be a fascinating game.
As for Podcast on the Brink, we'll be back next week at some point. We could be talking about a Sweet 16 matchup. Could be talking about Indiana season being over. That's the beauty of this time of year. You don't really know what's going to happen with the season, but it's been a fun ride, and it's good that Indiana's back in the tournament. Didn't have to sweat it out this season on Selection Sunday. Hoosier fans are excited about a potential run here in March. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.